Hello, International Relations classes. This is Professor Gustafson trying to connect with you via the first of probably many videos in this new educational environment. What a whirlwind week we've had. And given we don't totally know when all of this quarantine is going to be finished, I'll do my best to provide lectures for chapters 5, 7, and 9 via video format. Probably, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 videos per chapter because they'll probably end up being 10 or 15 minutes long a piece. As far as our Ebola pandemic project, we'll see what's going to happen with that, given the fact that we're kind of living it out right now. Besides that, I don't know if the April 13th date is going to hold that we can all gather together. It's all totally up in the air. If that takes place, we'll probably shift gears and I'll have to do some lectures on chapters 8 and chapter 6. But I guess just stay tuned. So without further ado, let's get started with the balance of chapter 5. Again, stay up on your readings. They'll be more important than normal, obviously. And of course, stay up on your discussion board posts, which are due Sunday of each week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin in chapter 5, and you should have gotten this an email announcement, rather, that you should have this file already. But I'm going to begin on slide number 25. And we're talking about how do you enforce International Court of Justice opinions, or just international law in general. And one of the ways that it can be done, again, ICJ rulings generally don't have an enforcement mechanism. They can make recommendations, but they cannot mandate that the particular countries that are within the adjudication have to comply. So one of the ways that it can be done is a powerful state takes on an enforcement role. And probably the greatest example of that would have been the United States in the 1990s, following the fall of the Russian, or the Soviet Union rather, and the end of the Cold War. The United States was kind of like the lone superpower standing in that unipolar moment. The United States was best positioned to kind of take on that role. They call it hegemonic stability theory, the idea that stability and order are maintained in the international system when a powerful state takes the lead. And in order for that to happen, a state has to have 3 attributes. First of all, it's got to have military capability and economic capability. In other words, it's got to have probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, military and economy in the world to make that happen. And then second of all, they have to be a commitment to the international community as it helps that nation's national interests. So in other words, the nation's national interests need to be aligned with what the international law is maintaining. And then third of all, they have to have the will to be able to act if necessary. And probably the greatest example of this occurred in the Iraq War in 1990-1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States in 1990-91, being the lead nation, led the UN coalition of nations into Kuwait to dislodge Iraq from Kuwait. And so that's a great example of again, this idea of enforcement via self-help through some powerful nation that's basically in charge. If you move forward here to slide 26, it talks about the role of international organizations, and we're going to talk about intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. Very simply, intergovernmental organizations are exactly that. There's some sort of coalition between various governments and nations that band together for some purpose. And then by contrast, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, do not involve nation states. They involve various organizations, private organizations, but many times organizations that span the scope of one nation and basically can be transnational, can be international, and again, deal with issues of international importance, not the least of which is some sort of international health care dealing with the pandemic. You can see very easily where an NGO would be very, very important in moments like that, because no single nation could perhaps be strong enough to deal with it. But if you had an NGO that could coordinate a whole host of nations working together, you can see where that could be very effective. So if you look at slide number 27, you can see the three basic types of IGOs. The first is a global general purpose IGO, and an example of that, of course, would be the United Nations. Secondly, you've got the regional IGOs, and these are, again, connections or coalitions of a particular region. Again, the greatest example of that is the European Union. You also have the Organization of American States and the African Union. And then the third type of IGO is a functional IGO. In other words, they gather together not so much based on region, but based on some designed goal. Again, probably the greatest example of that would be OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies. Okay, countries are again, they gather together for that particular purpose. If you move forward here to slide number 98 or 28 rather, you can see where the importance of IGOs is they mitigate anarchy. Again, they arose after World War II following the obviously the total international collapse that occurred in the world. And so they prevent some sort of chaos taking place. They can pool capabilities to prevent global challenges, kind of like NATO. They generally are linked with the development of international law. IGOs are created by treaties by member nations, and it's a product of international treaty law. So in other words, they don't go away quickly because, again, most nations consented to this that have joined an IGO, or in fact, all nations have consented to this. They're generally established to monitor compliance with a particular treaty. So again, you think of the United Nations and their role in 1990 when Saddam Hussein was breaking compliance with UN resolutions. The same occurred in 2002, 2003, when it was found that Iraq was violating various sanctions ordered by the United Nations. Again, that's where an international governmental organization like the UN would obviously become very, very important. They also provide a forum for negotiating new treaties among states, and they can also act as the enforcement arm of international law. Again, a great example of that occurred in 1991 when the United States and the coalition of nations working with the U.S. in conjunction with the UN enforced UN sanctions and regulations, which Iraq violated when it invaded Kuwait. Moving towards slide number 29, it talks about various non-governmental organizations. And again, NGOs are organizations that are established and operate independently of the formal control of governments. Think Greenpeace. Think Amnesty International. Think of perhaps the work of the Red Cross or something like that, that again spans multiple nations dealing with an issue. Again, what's going on in our world right now in March of 2020 is a great example of where NGOs could be very, very important. If you go to slide 30, it basically talks about the fact that NGOs use multiple tactics to achieve their directives. They can provide direct assistance to communities in need. They can publicize the actions of government. Again, if government is probably a great example of when NGOs tend to kick in very strongly is when there's been violation of human rights in a country, and they can kind of act as a whistleblower to let the international community know what's going on. And they can also lobby various states to influence various policy outcomes. Moving on to slide number 31, NGOs work very closely with IGOs. Again, NGOs work very closely with the United Nations. Many of them receive consultative status with the UN, so they act as consultants in various forums of the United Nations. And again, because they can work together, they can accomplish many times more than just a governmental agency. Again, if you think it through a little bit, whereas a nation might not let the United Nations in, but they might let the Red Cross in or Amnesty International. In other words, sometimes they're less threatening than some sort of collective coercive governmental force moving into those various countries. You can see, again, we're going to focus now upon the United Nations, beginning in slide number 32. Obviously, the UN is the most important IGO since World War II. It consists of 193 nations. The only non-members are Vatican City and Palestine, both of which have an observer status. Taiwan has de facto status, but it has not been recognized as a sovereign state. And the main reason that has occurred is because China is trying to bring Taiwan into the fold, into basically being dominated by the Chinese government. Taiwan doesn't want to do that. The United States has taken the side of Taiwan. So you've got China and the United States disagreeing pretty strongly about that. And so that's where if Taiwan was recognized as a state within the United Nations, most likely China would veto that. So in other words, that's why Taiwan has been historically kept in limbo. Let's see, if you go to slide 33, many of these IGOs work together, the NGOs have worked together, and probably the most important, or one of the more important aspects of the United Nations is kind of the smaller organizations that work within it, like the International Monetary Fund, again, that deals with a lot of currency issues between nations, and the World Health Organization, which is receiving all kinds of prominent news coverage right now because of this coronavirus pandemic. They're very important. And then they've got the Atomic Energy Agency as well, again, that monitors nuclear proliferation. So the significance of the UN as an IGO as compared to other IGOs like the European Union or like OPEC is that it is the only IGO that has authority to actually use military power to promote global security. In other words, OPEC can very dramatically affect oil prices, but it's not sending the military over to the United States to deal with an issue or something to that effect. Now, if you look at slide number 34, it begins to kind of break down the various aspects of the UN. You've got the Security Council, which is the primary arm of the United Nations. It is charged with maintaining international peace and security. Again, the Security Council is basically the power broker within the United Nations. It's made up of 15 different countries, 5 of which are what are called the PERM 5 nations. These are the 5 victorious nations after World War II. That would be the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, or Russia now, China, and France, and then 10 other nations that serve in 2-year rotating terms. And so basically, in order to get something accomplished in the Security Council, 9/15 of the members have to agree. And including that, all 5 of the PERM 5 members must agree. If one of them disagree, even though there might be 10 10/15 or 11/15 or something to that effect, one PERM 5 member vetoing can shut an entire initiative in the UN down. Secondly, another arm of the UN is the General Assembly. That is the quasi-legislative arm of the UN. They issue non-binding resolutions and declarations, and they serve as a forum for international states. So generally, the General Assembly does not have a lot of teeth, not like the Security Council does. But again, if you think it through, after World War II, the UN was created to get nations talking to one another. Even if they didn't get a lot of things done, the idea is far better for nations to talk and to voice their opinions than it would be to have them shooting at each other. The third arm of the UN is the Secretariat. That's the bureaucratic arm that gets a lot of the things done behind the scenes. It is led by the UN Secretary General, who, after consulting with the General Assembly, will bring items to the Security Council. And then the other arms or sections or components of the UN, if you look at slide number 35, you've got the Economic and Social Council. Again, they coordinate UN economic and social programs, like the International Monetary Fund. Again, they're dealing with a lot of trade issues. You've got WHO, which is the World Health Organization. And then you've got the World Bank. And what the World Bank does is it tends to work with other countries that are dealing with severe need. And if aid needs to go to those countries, it goes through the World Bank. And then the International Court of Justice is another component, and that's the World Court, which we've already talked about that. And then the Trusteeship Council, and what the Trusteeship Council does is it works with trust territories. In other words, these are areas of the world that are not states yet, helping them to become states. And again, this has not really been active since 1994, since Palau was the last trust territory that gained independence. And then moving on to slide number 36, this is the structure of the United Nations. You can kind of see that slide, and it shows you in more of a pictorial form all of the different arms of the United Nations. You can kind of avail yourself of that. So that's probably enough for now in this video segment, and I'll kind of resume beginning with slide number 37.